Okay, I'm Carol Chandler. I'm the program chairman for the Lee County Historical and Genealogical Society. And we have a wonderful program tonight, but I'd like to make a short announcement too. I have a deep personal compassion for all of our Vietnam vets. They put their lives on the line for us, and they came back to United States citizens who were really, really angry about a lot of things, and they resented the veterans a lot. One gentleman told me that they were told not to go out of the airport until after 4 because that's when the protesters had to leave. Another gentleman was told that his group was told, don't wear your uniforms for your own safety. Anyway, I'm going to have something on Veterans Day for all of our guys we lost in Vietnam in the states, in the counties of Lee, Ogle, and Whiteside. So it will be at Lasta Park in Franklin Grove, 2 p.m. on Wednesday, November 11th. So please come out and support our guys. The names of all of our guys we lost in these 3 counties will be read, okay? And I'm having a tree planted in their honor. Okay, now for the good stuff. Bill Shaw is going to talk to us tonight on the 150th anniversary of the Illinois 75th, which also covered Lee County and Whiteside and Lee. So please welcome Bill Shaw.
Well, I could start any number of places, but I should respond to that, Carol. I was one of the U.S. Army soldiers during the Vietnam War that slinked back into town kind of quietly under the radar after my service was over. I felt a lot of that, even though I didn't get sent over to Vietnam. It was a different time. If anything, I personally feel very happy to see that our current soldiers and veterans are given a lot more support. And appreciate your comments on that. It's kind of awkward for me to be standing up here. I'm supposed to be talking about history a little bit, and I'm looking out at the people who are some of the great historians in our county, our town, and I'm not a little bit awe-inspired by some of the things that have been done in the past. In the genealogy and the history over the years and the things you're currently doing. I was publisher of the newspaper, the Dixon Telegraph, for 20 years. And one thing that was very important to me was that the newspaper project to all the people in the community, including the new people coming into the community, that this town, it wasn't just here. A lot of things happened in the history of this community to make it where we are today. And I felt that that story needed to be put in the paper on a regular basis, that especially the new people in town would appreciate all that had gone into building this area up. And fortunately, I had some great people along the way who volunteered, basically, or with a little bit of help, to research and put stories in the newspaper, pictures, stories, and I really felt really that was an important part of the newspaper, not just the current news, but to put it into perspective of things in the past. So I do want to thank those of you who helped me out with that over the years. Now, going forward, I think hopefully the community has a better understanding of exactly where we came from and the great foundation upon which the current leaders are building. I have to say I'm very impressed that there's actually some people here with the World Series divisional playoff going on. What is this, the divisional playoff they call it? Wow, I kind of wondered if anyone would be here, but I'm sure glad you're here. But I have to ask, and this will kind of lead into what I'm trying to say today. How many Cardinal fans So we'll start out with the Sox. How many Sox fans are in the room here? White Sox? No, go ahead. You have to raise your hand. And, I'm going to ask 3 questions. How many Cub fans are there here? And how many Cardinal fans do we have here? Okay. See, now this is, and see, I think everyone was a little sheepish on that, those answers, but I know you have heated discussions everywhere about which team to root for, and especially with the Sox and the Cubs, and with the Cardinals and the Cubs. And I've enjoyed that discussions over the year, listening to people and the passion that people have. It's their allegiance towards something. In this case, happens to be a baseball team. Now, there are some people that I know, some people live in Dixon, that really don't care for Cubs if they're a Cardinal fan. I don't know too many Cub fans that don't care for Cardinal fans, but I know there's a lot of White Sox fans, and it seems to be an animosity if it's kind of in jest or whatever, but sometimes it gets pretty serious. But that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit in a different context tonight, and that's allegiance. Because as I'm going to get into with the Civil War and all this, and we talked a little bit about Vietnam, allegiance to a country or a religion, that's really a driving force. I was in a conversation once with quite a thoughtful person who suggested to me that patriotism was not a good thing. And I've been thinking about it ever since, because I think all of us would say patriotism is really important, and it's a good thing. But taken to the extreme, in cases it's been a cause of many wars. If you think about the patriotism the Germans had, and the way Hitler fanned that up, that nationalism, we had a world war because of it. So I've always felt, how do you put these things into perspective in our own lives? This is something I'm grappling with. In fact, it's been over 20 years I've been contemplating, is it the merits and the pros and cons of patriotism. I haven't really been able to sort it out yet, but I still think that we have a country that we want to be proud of, that we need to be proud of. But here I am, born in the United States, so my allegiance is to the United States of America. If I were born in Canada, I would have a different allegiance. Does that mean one is right and one is wrong, or how do you, and as the world events shake out, it's a challenging thing. But the need to instill patriotism, the need to instill allegiance, I do think there's a need for that. And so did somebody else many, many years ago. And his name was Francis Bellamy. Now, and I'm talking about the year 1892, which was about the year the Lee County Historical Society was founded. When was the Historical Society first founded?
1903.
1903, so it was about 11 years afterwards. Does anybody know what he did?
Yep.
Okay, anybody, just ready, don't say. Who Jim knows. Anybody else have that name ring a bell anywhere in history? Well, then why don't you tell us?
He wrote a book titled Looking Backward.
Actually, he did something else. He came up with the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States. And I'd like to talk about that. Isn't that interesting that we said the Pledge of Allegiance today? And we say it at every Rotary meeting I'm at. It's still in vogue, even though that was over 100 years ago when it first was. In 1892, it was about 30 years after the World War, after the Civil War. And there was a feeling that patriotism and nationalism was at a low was diminishing and people were concerned about it. So Mr. Francis Bellamy came up with the idea that they should do something about it. And he came up with the idea of doing a pledge of allegiance. And the purpose of this was to create and reinforce an ambition to carry on the American ideals that so many people had sacrificed for. And the sacrifice was immense. It was horrendous, the sacrifice that had gone on to make give us the opportunity to live these American ideas. So he actually came up with the idea, that's a long story, this was more of a, he was a religious figure. Over the years, the Knights of Columbus have been very involved in getting this thing going. I can kind of briefly go through it. He was a Baptist minister, Francis Bellamy. And 1892, what do you suppose? It was the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering, and it would coincided with the Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair. And they felt this time they needed to do something to make a statement, something to reinstill patriotism, reinstill national pride. So they came up with this idea: why don't we have in all the schools a ceremony on October 12th, I guess 1892. Was that the day that Columbus discovered America? Was it October? I don't know when he first saw Cape Cod, but maybe that was. But anyway, on October the 12th, they decided to have a ceremony. And he came up with this slogan, and then we're going to put a flag in every school, and then different places around public meetings and that, and the Columbian Exposition and all that. A really incredible national effort in one day to make this thing happen. Well, they did make it happen, and it's carried on from there. Now, I have to tell you, it's changed a little bit, and I would like somebody to come up and help me. How about Andy? I need you to do the Pledge of Allegiance for me here, except I'm going to ask you to do the original one. Now, the posture is this. Now, first of all, you know, military people, including people who are veterans, are supposed to salute. Everybody else is supposed to put their hand over their heart, and if you have a hat on, you hold it like that. The things you're supposed to do. It's all legislatively approved by Congress. But that wasn't the way it used to be at first. The first pose was put your right hand out like that.
This is on tape.
No, hold it. Get closer so you can hear it. Yeah, get closer. Is he gonna? Okay. And then repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to my flag.
I pledge allegiance to my flag.
And the republic for which it stands.
And the republic for which it stands.
One nation indivisible.
One nation indivisible.
With liberty and justice for all.
With liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. How about that? Now, obviously some things have changed since 1892. But first of all, it had to be adopted by Congress. It was formally adopted in not until 1945, believe it or not. But before that, it was it was, I can't remember which president now, back Harrison. It says here somewhere. I can skip through. They got it going. Benjamin Harrison, he was the president when they first recognized this officially. Obviously, there have been some changes. The first one was they changed it. I pledge allegiance to my flag in the republic and the republic they changed to I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic. Now, that was just a little grammatical thing they wanted to add. They were worried about the way it flowed too, so they couldn't. And the concept of liberty and justice for all, they felt they could safely say that. They talked about equality and fraternity, but that wasn't quite working because women couldn't vote and there was a problem with the different racial things. And, you know, it was things that were different back then. So they had, the republic, they chose a republic because this is the strength of the country. They felt was a republic, not necessarily another form of government. They changed the one little typo. That was in 1892, the very first year they threw the 2 in there. And that lasted until 1923. And then they changed it to I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. Now the reason for that was, if they were to say I pledge allegiance to my flag, there were many immigrants coming in to the United States at that time. And it got a little confusing what my flag was, and it was pretty obvious. They felt they needed to clarify that. And then, actually the next year, they added to the flag of the United States of America. They added of America in there too, for some reason. I don't know officially who was responsible for these things, but that's just the way it happened. And then in 45 is when it was officially adopted. And in 52, while Truman was president, then there started to be a feeling about one nation under God. And they felt that that should be put in there. It was from Lincoln. From Lincoln's speech in the Gettysburg Address, even though it isn't written out in Lincoln's handwriting, the common feeling is that Lincoln put our nation under God as he gave his speech. So somehow they felt that was important, especially in 52. That was when the communist thing was going on and the fear of communism, that they felt what separated the United States and made it great. Well, a lot of people felt it was because we were one nation under God. And so by 1954, they actually officially made that part of the Pledge of Allegiance. So that's the evolution of the Pledge of Allegiance. And I found that kind of interesting for me because I say it every week somewhere, it seems like, my whole life. You kind of never think about it. Or maybe some of you think about that are a little more thoughtful than I am. Some things become routine and you don't really appreciate it. And the reason why I really am appreciating it this year is because something happened 150 years ago this year. And I would maybe ask each one of you historians, what was the most emotional or greatest day in the history of Dixon? The worst tragedy in Dixon was probably the bridge collapse, I would say. Everyone might have a different opinion. But something happened 150 years ago, and I actually designed to give this speech on July 4th, and I gave it several places on July 4th, so I'm thinking July 4th of this year. Probably representing the greatest tragedy that ever happened to our county and to our city, even greater than the bridge. And probably one of the most emotional days. I would say it had to be the most emotional and exciting and special days in the history of the town. And that's the day the Illinois 75th marched back into Dixon. Well, actually they marched back in Dixon the 2nd of July, but the 4th of July was Independence Day celebration. And that was can you imagine the emotion of these people that, in talking about the Vietnam guys, in this case, our guys, the 75th. Now, when I say the 75th, there was maybe I've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 different regiments that local soldiers actually participated in. The 75th was probably the one that had the most from this area. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because my ancestor in my genealogy, along with almost 1,000 men from either Lee County, Whiteside County, or Ogle County, were part of, all exclusively our area. They marched back into town, and those that were left, and there weren't a lot of them left. I'm not sure exactly where to go to here, but I'll just dive in on who would. First of all, now in the last year or two, as I've really gotten into this, I love to take off in my car and go down West First Street and go underneath what I call the ramparts. That's the bridge thing. I call them Dixon's Ramparts, and drive around those blocks there. That was where Camp DeMint was. That's where they trained. That's where these guys trained, and other groups had trained too. If you imagine that was nothing but you know, a first, second, third, I don't know how far it went, but that was a huge training camp where there were 1,000 soldiers that were there. And I drive through there and just, I can't see any ghosts, but I just try to imagine what that must have been like, preparing for war and marching. As it turned out, my ancestor, I have quite a few ancestors that were alive back then that lived here, but one of them who was from Sterling, his name was William Kilgore, and he was actually a lawyer in Sterling. And he had actually started signing up for the Illinois 34th, no, the 17th, which was a year earlier. And he went into the service, and they fought in Missouri, but he got sick and came back. And so in 1962, in October, it's actually in August of 1862, he wrote a letter to Governor Yates and said, we need to get another regiment up from this area. And he was given the authority to organize another regiment, have them train here at Camp DeMint. And about 1,000 people answered the call. That's not quite right. Somewhere around 800 to 900, and then more came on a little bit later. So here they were training, and this was like September 20, we'll say 25th was a Sunday, or 27th was a Sunday, and they all left the camp, and they went in, marched into town, and went to church at the various churches in town. The next day, they were shipped out. September 28th, 1862. By October 8th, 1862, 2 weeks later, 43 of them were already dead. 150 were wounded, and 12 had been captured. And of those wounded, many died a few days later. My own ancestor, William Kilgore, in that battle in Perryville, Kentucky, was shot right through his body, right through his stomach, his liver, and his spleen. And they thought for sure he was going to die. Somehow he did not die. I don't know what happened, but the good Lord was with him. He came back here, he was convalescent, and unfortunately by September 1st, he was back fighting with the regiment just as the Battle of Chickamauga was about to commence, and he got wounded again there. He was, at that point, he was a major. Battle after battle after battle, these guys, my ancestor missed the second battle, which was Stones River, and the casualties to this group was just about as bad as Perryville. So they had lost about half of their people by the end of the year, by end of 1862, of the original people that were there. Those were actually the two worst battles that this particular regiment was in. But just imagine and then as we're thinking about what they were there for, what they were doing, when we think about the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That's what the Civil War, that's why these guys were there. And I'm glad we say it every week, but it really is hard to fathom what it actually took to make that something that we can actually enjoy today. Let me just tell you a little bit about the overall. Now, this was just the Illinois, the overall. Now, I can't, unfortunately, we're in Lee County. I don't have, maybe, Pat, you could get, the figures are for Lee County are somewhere. I don't have them, but I do have Whiteside counties in a history book that I have that was easy for me to get. What happened, there would have been a draft here in these counties if we didn't have enough people volunteer for service. But as the Civil War went on, we just barely had enough people to volunteer for service in Lee County and Whiteside County that we had no draft, or Ogle County. How much was that? In Whiteside County, which would I think would be similar to Lee County at that time, there were 18,700, almost 19,000 people. That was the population of Whiteside County in 1860. How many volunteers for war? There were 2,535 men that volunteered for the Civil War in a county of 19,000, which presumably had about 9,000 or 10,000 men. And that means 25% of all the living males in Whiteside County, and I presume Lee County, volunteered to fight in the Civil War, volunteered to, with their allegiance to the flag. That, to me, I just can't hardly imagine that. But that's what happened, and those are the and all the names. And I've talked to Pat about this. You have this down in your office. This is the reason I got on this was a guy by the name of Fred South from Prophetstown, Illinois, wrote his college thesis on history, and he decided to choose the Illinois 75th for his topic. He's 70-some years old now. He's never quit writing this book. He's still adding on to it with people bring him information. They bring him letters from family soldiers, and he, but he's got the name of every person who ever fought in the Illinois 75th right in this book here, as well as what happened to them when they're mustered out, killed, and all that. I mean, there's page to page reference and for genealogy, and that's why I really got involved in this, because I was interested in my ancestor and learning about my ancestry, the genealogy. And this is the type of work that you all are doing, and that Fred did, that allows somebody like me, who really had never done much of this at all, to really get a handle on what was happening. At the end of the war, my ancestor and some others commissioned a guy, William Sumner Dodge, an author, to come here. And he wrote a book about the Illinois 75th. And it was first-hand experiences of all of these, everything that happened during the Civil War, everywhere they went, what their life was like, what the battles were like, all the challenges of living the disease. It's a book, and I actually have a copy of it. I actually found a copy of it. And I was just done so that those of us 160 years or 200 years down the road would have something to look at and appreciate what they went through. And I feel so blessed that that was there. And so, in honor of that, after studying it for 10 years, last year my son and I, we decided to take a little trip. And we retraced the route of the Illinois 75th, the entire route of the 75th. Perryville, Kentucky was the start, and then they went to Tennessee. Chattanooga, they charged up the Lookout Mountain, part of that Missionary Ridge. Before that, they got caught at Chickamauga. It was a disaster. And then they were in the battle to Atlanta. All those battles all the way down, continual fighting for 3 months. And then the capture of Atlanta. And then when Sherman went off to the sea, the Illinois 75th stayed with Thomas, George Thomas, toward Franklin, Tennessee, and then Nashville. And they played a huge role in the final battle of Nashville when the Southwestern Army was destroyed. John Bell Hood was a Confederate head at that point. So anyway, because of all the historical work, I just sit back basically and get a chance to read what all these other people have done to put in my lap, and then actually go out and physically enjoy. There's a battlefield in Perryville, Kentucky, where our people suffered their greatest losses. I was just there last week. I decided that all my Civil War artifacts, which included my ancestor's sword and the buttons off his uniform, his belt buckle, his insignias, I donated them to the museum down there, and they have put them on display. And I'm really proud of the fact that they did a real nice job of, and they were real happy to have that, because these were things that are actually there on the battlefield. So there's one other thing I have. And how are we doing on time? Do you have a few more minutes?
We're good.
Because of the newspapers, another nice thing fell into my lap. And it's reported that this was actually printed in the Telegraph, but I know it was in the Gazette on July 4th of 1865, when these guys marched back into town after going through this horrible ordeal. The towns, their hometowns, threw wonderful banquets and picnics for them. Imagine the celebration. And it was fairly spontaneous too. The 34th, for example, wasn't here yet. They were marching in the Grand March in Washington, D.C. I don't know if any of you heard about that. So many soldiers got together in Washington and marched. So they weren't back, but the 75th was back, and they asked my ancestor, Colonel Kilgore, to give a speech on behalf of the troops. And for some reason, it was a significant enough speech that it was reprinted word for word in the newspaper. And I happen to have a copy of it. And I was hoping you might indulge me while I read it. I echoed those words. Would that be okay?
Fine, yes.
And here he is speaking to the crowd. And he said, "We are glad to meet you. It is not necessary for me to say this is a happy day for us. None here are so base as not to love and be rejoiced to see his father, mother, brother, sister, or his wife and children, from whom he has been separated for nearly 3 long and bloody years. We went from you as part of you to battle for our common country and to maintain the Union and the government of the United States, and to deliver the country from that vortex of ruin into which, incited thereto by slave power, it is well nigh driven by aid of the Democratic Party, led by James Buchanan." There's the politics there. "Historic truth should be no less sacred than religion. Let all be careful and make a wide and broad line between their country and their party in the future. We come back, a remnant of us, to assume again as citizens the peaceful avocations of life. All could not go to war. You have nobly and patriotically sustained us while absent in the field, against a foe in our front and a fire in our rear. Like in Vietnam, there was a lot of people who were critical of the war effort, causing difficulties for our military, and have cordially received us on our return. For this determined support while away and this hearty welcome home, accept our grateful thanks. Whether we are worthy of you or not, we point to our record. We came back, I say, a remnant. Our comrades sleep, the sleep that knows no waking, on almost every battlefield, from the Ohio River to the Atlantic, and repose in patriots' graves, in nearly every hospital burying ground, and at most of the rebel prison pens in the Union or the defunct so-called Confederacy. And then he starts to talk about some of these. This may mean something to some of you about the specific battles. At Perryville, Stone River, Liberty Gap, and at Chickamauga, again crossing Lookout Creek in the face of fire of the enemy, and helping in the work of scaling and carrying that mighty fortress of nature. Has anyone seen Lookout Mountain? That's an incredible place. I had a chance to see that. And at Mission Ridge and Ringgold, again at Buzzard's Roost, Rocky Face Ridge, at Dalton, Resaca, Dallas, Pine Mountain, those are on the way to Atlanta. Our division extinguished the light of the Rebel General, Bishop Leonidas Polk at Kennesaw Mountain, at Culp's Farm, Chattahoochee, Atlanta, Jonesboro, and Lovejoy Station. Again on Hood's track through Snake Creek Gap in Alabama and on his flank to Franklin, Tennessee, where we had the honor of taking part in that sanguinary engagement which destroyed Hood's army. Here the rebel bravery amounted to insolent rashness, and dearly they answered for it. 6 rebel generals laid in state of Franklin the next day. Major Bushnell, who was a very prominent person who was killed in the previous battle, was avenged. 6 wounded and 1 we took prisoner. Those are all the generals that were captured in Franklin. The next day at the second day of battle at Nashville, the 75th on the second day charged and took 2 lines of rebel works in succession. You have heard of the old French Guard, of which it was said, it never recoiled. And of the English writer, and of the English under Wellington at Waterloo, who only moved close up and covered the dead bodies of their comrades. Better men than these you have among you. I have seen this regiment repeatedly advance under withering fire of grape and canister, shell and musketry, and leave none behind but the dead and wounded. Isn't that incredible? Just imagine what they went through for 3.5 long years. The doctrine, not of states' rights, for states have rights, but the right of any state to secede has been, I hope, unalterable and forever settled in this country. And as one of the results of the war, slavery is abolished. One nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Time has done its work with you as well with us. And some of the old familiar faces that were here when we left are no longer here. And then he mentions Kirk. Kirk was a general in charge of the 35th Illinois Regiment. They met at Stones, they fought together at Stones River. Kirk was killed. And does anyone know who Kirk was? If you've been to the Washington Dillon house in Sterling, that was Kirk's house. When he went down, when Kirk went down, 'twas as when a giant of the forest falls headlong. And then he mentioned several other people that we would know names of. Bushnell, Ward, Parrott, Captain Hale, Bory, Eels, Thompson, Glean, Bryant, Buckaloo. Those are names that we know from the history. are all no more, and opposite whose names on the muster out rolls are seen the heroic remarks, killed in battle, died of wounds, or disease in the service of their country. By the way, Colonel Kilgore's brother was also killed in Perryville. Now let us who have been soldiers, and you who have not been soldiers, remember kindly those who have returned from the field, and widows and orphans of those who fell. Peace hath its victories no less renowned than war. So I think that's another story of some soldiers that came back from a war in a little bit different circumstances, but great sacrifice that they made. So I guess that pretty much covers what I wanted to mention today about, really about the Pledge of Allegiance and about what the words are. And 150 years ago, what happened here that still has a bearing on us as we look to, and I think gives us a sense of responsibility for all that was sacrificed for us to continue to instill that feeling of national pride. That's basically, I think, most of what I had to say, but I'd like to ask about any questions anybody might have.
How many men were in the 35th?
34th?
34th, excuse me.
It was it's a little bit smaller, but there were 2,500 altogether in Whiteside County. I would say there were probably about 3,000 more between Lee County and Ogle County, maybe 3,000 or 4,000.
And how many lost their lives?
I'm going to say 57%. 57% of everybody who left either was killed or wounded or died of a disease. Now, the interesting thing is my great-great-grandfather, he wasn't counted. He came back. He was one of the 263 that marched back into town. And he'd been shot horribly, he was wounded 300 times. Just imagine in the Battle of Perryville, that first battle, the flag of the 75th Regiment, they counted 41 bullet holes in it at the end of the battle. And the stanchion had been shortened 4 times. How would you like been holding that? Or how many people? And there's so many things. I'm sure a lot of you have gotten into the Civil War and been to different battlefields and got probably a much better feeling than what I have. But it's just unimaginable to me what they went through, and then to read about all the deprivations. And like this one guy who wrote he was from, I don't know, it might have even been Harmon or somewhere, but he was writing letters home. He got scurvy, and he was in the hospital. And they diagnosed that he had scurvy. And they said, okay, what you need is some fruit and vegetables. But there were no fruits and vegetables, even at the hospital. He was another year in the hospital before he could get nourishment in order to just recover from scurvy. And that was some of the horrible challenges, especially at the first half of the war. And toward the end of the war, supplies started coming in a little bit better for him, I think, but it was just unimaginable. How about another question? Jim?
Has there ever been a study made of the percentage of casualties and types of physical impairment that went on during our Civil War compared to wars that were going on, say, in Europe about the same time?
Okay, let me just, I got some interesting insight on this on my last trip, or something I've read in the last year. The Civil War was a convergence, where there was some technology that was happening, but the tactics and the strategy had not evolved, so it was a slaughter. Earlier, maybe they were using knives and swords and bayonets or something, I don't know, and arrows and bows, and but during the Civil War, the repeating rifle started to be used, or instead of making one shot every 55 seconds, they could load in 6 shells and take 6 shots every minute and 20 seconds or something like that. And, but they were still doing these full frontal assault charges. So I don't know, I haven't seen any of the numbers, but I do know that, and if, I have lost a lot of respect for General Sherman. I probably shouldn't say that on tape. But he was one who just, they needed to win, and he just kept throwing people, especially at the Battle of Kennesaw. Now, they just kept throwing, and the other generals said, we can't do this. We just can't keep throwing these people up there. But he didn't listen. He just kept throwing them. Finally, after the 7th assault on that thing, and they lost 6,000-7,000 soldiers, he finally gave up on it. But that way, and then you've all heard of Pickett's Charge. Well, there was a lot of things like that in the Civil War where the weaponry, and then of course they had the cannons, which would just wipe out huge swaths of soldiers as they would be charging hills. So I think that looking back at it, that historical perspective or second guessing, wow, they weren't, except for a few of the generals, and you know, the ones that were, you've heard about McClellan. I think he actually was a poor general, but Thomas is the one I've been reading about lately. This guy was he was from Virginia, and he still fought for the Union, even though Stonewall Jackson and Lee were from Virginia and they fought for the Confederates. He fought for the Union. They'd all been at West Point. Well, he really tried to not charge the enemy unless it was wise. He got criticized for being too slow. And he's probably the greatest Union general. From what I've read, he's the greatest Union general as far as what he got. The whole Battle of Nashville was his. He saved the day at Chickamauga. It might have been reversed the course of the war if it had been for Thomas and his people in Chickamauga, which every other Union general ran. He stuck there until everyone had cleared out, and then. But anyway, you don't hear much about him, but he really had less casualties per battle, and Sherman by far had the most, and Grant, both were huge casualties, and they felt that's the way they had to win it, and certainly there were Confederate generals that had the same feeling, but I think I've never talked to too many people current military history, you know, at West Point or Carlisle Barracks where they have the Army War College. But I would think, I'd be interested to hear their feelings about professional looking at the carnage there and being able to think which generals actually had the best solution toward all this. But that's just, I've been actually reading quite a bit about that and wondering myself, minimizing casualties versus winning a war and the balance of that. And it certainly was a time of great change in military tactics at the Civil War.
Bill, you mentioned the color bearer. We had a gentleman come in about a year and a half ago, and he was from Spokane, Washington. He and his brother, their ancestors, I believe, was George Steele. I may be wrong on the first name, it's been a while. But he was a color bearer for the 34th Illinois Infantry, and in one battle he was shot 7 times. And he lived to tell about it.
That's amazing. You know, it's amazing
7
to us.
times.
I have a feeling that of this 263 people that marched back to town, I can't imagine any of them didn't have a few wounds.
Yeah, it's just amazing.
They were just somehow able to.
And those weren't little bullets they were using. They weren't using bullets. They were using 57 caliber, I believe it was.
So anyway, that puts, I guess, the Civil War, we read a lot about, but a little perspective on what actually the impact it had here. 25% of our male population participated as volunteers into the regiments. And of course, that left, 80% of them were farmers. 82% of them, I think, were farmers. And imagine it, I think I checked out in those days, the population of Harmon Township, which is what, 110 now, or something like that?
Something like that,
It
yeah.
was like 700 back
Bars
then,
are open.
or 5, I mean, it's a lot more. But those families had big families, and they had maybe 6 kids. Well, they sent 3 of them and they got $50. And to begin the Civil War, they got a $50 bonus for signing up, and that was enough to entice quite a few people. But by the second or third round, I think it was up to $200 or something like that. And then the pay was an issue too. Fred South had recovered the diary of the chaplain, Chaplain Smith from Fulton of the Illinois 75th. He's printed that up too. By the way, Fred could he could make copies of this for anybody that would be interested in it.
Yeah, he still sells them.
The chaplain was given the payroll about 10 months out, and he took all the money for the entire regiment, came back here to Lee County and Whiteside County and Oak County, and passed the money out to the families. And it just amazes me the things that happen. And it wasn't very much money, but for somehow, and they were in for 3 years or the course of the war. And that was a pretty scary thing for a lot of people too, because they thought the war was going to be over in 6 months. But they realized after that first battle, 12 days into it, that this was going to be no capable. How about another question?
I'm curious about, you said this was your great-great-grandfather, this was your maternal side?
Okay, my family goes back quite a ways. We go back some in Dixon, but my family goes back a lot farther in Sterling. Ezekiel Kilgore came to Sterling in 1837, and he settled a farm which is now called Sterling, Illinois. The Kilgore Park, if any of you know that. He had basically everything from where that locust, you know where locust kind of makes that curve, he had everything north of that.
Okay.
Of course, he couldn't farm it, but he was a very industrious person. He led the first cattle drive to the city of Chicago, I think, in at least from Sterling, from Whiteside County, 1842. He died in 1845, leaving his wife and 5 small children, except the farm. But at that point, my ancestor would have been 4 years old. He was the oldest of the family, so he had to take over. And but you know, the first school class in Whiteside County, he was one of the students, and he was very involved in most everything. He was a lawyer. Monahan was his partner at one time. People have heard of the Monahan house. Well, he was, and so that would be my father. My father is that no one here would remember my dad. He grew up in Dixon. You remember my dad? Sure. His name was E.K. Shaw. He was born in 1925. His name was Eustace Kilgore Shaw. He had three last names. In 1856, when the Republicans had their first convention, Eustace and Kilgore and Shaw were all there. And they were all there when Lincoln was nominated. But Kilgore, he was the one who actually went with 700 Illinoisans to Washington, D.C. for Lincoln's inauguration. And they were very concerned that Lincoln wouldn't make it because of the threats of assassination. So 700 people from Illinois didn't ride on the same train with Lincoln, but they were there. And Kilgore was obviously a very staunch supporter of Abraham Lincoln, along with the other ones. So that my family is kind of hooked in 3 different ways. So that would be my great-great-grandfather, and my father's mother. My father's mother was Susan Kilgore. That would be her grandfather. That's sister. That's the genealogy. And the Kilgores came from Pennsylvania, like a lot of people around here, from Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, 1836. In Dixon and Lee County, 1818, was that, when did, 1820?
What, Dixon?
No.
1830.
1830.
It was Dixon, yeah.
So it was 6 years after. Whiteside County was developed a little bit behind Lee County. Okay, about that? Anybody else? Did you have a question?
Well, I had a question. I can't remember when it was invented, but the machine gun was important in warfare because it was a very effective defensive weapon. They had no way of going against machine guns until the internal combustion engine was perfected, and they made the crawler tractors. And that gave rise to the tanks. And before that, defenses with machine guns were almost impregnable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was that, and it's interesting, I could get political now.
Here, you go first.
Greg, don't let me get political. But the countries that have survived have the ones that have invested and come up with the best technology for warfare. And the countries that let that slip, they get in trouble. And I think if you read about the Civil War or any other war, obviously the ones that had the technological advantage ended up doing better. I think that's truth that still lives today.
Bill, you know, one of the unfortunate things, people have been looking for editions of the Dixon Evening Telegraph during the
So
Civil
I.
War for 40 years that I'm aware.
Well, actually, my great-grandmother was looking for it
Was it?
in 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
It's been 100, it's
Yeah.
been 100 years, more than 100 years we've been looking for those editions.
Isn't it crazy?
Yeah.
And
Something
no
bad
one
happened.
knows where they all disappeared.
No, and you keep wondering if they're not squirreled away somewhere, but I don't know. And I think she probably would have known because there were different people involved at different times. But when I first came to Dixon, that fact was brought up to me, and that was back in 1971 when I first started working in the newspaper. We don't have those editions. It's a real shame. Isn't that nice that we do have everything else? And other newspapers like the Amboy and the
Yeah.
different communities, those papers, what a valuable resource. Your
Amboy's been a
work is
savior.
based on, it's amazing now that you guys have done so much with those old copies to really get them organized,
Yeah, they're all
to get
indexed.
them useful. I really appreciate, I've been aware of that effort for many years, and I really appreciate the effort that's gone into that. I think it's great for the community. Thank you.